Okay. We've looked quite a bit at requirements so far. We have learned the difference between good and bad requirements based on the key principles of clarity, completeness, applicability, prioritization, implementability, and testability. I'm not sure those last two are actual words, but I'm going to stick with them. We've also classified requirements into different types: business, user, functional, and non-functional. And we've looked at many examples of requirements and how they tie together or trace together. What we haven't discussed so far is the actual process of gathering requirements, and we're going to have this as our topic for the next two sections of our lecture. So now let's talk a little about where requirements come from. In this part of the lecture, I'm going to refer to three different sources of requirements. Keep in mind, however, that there are undoubtedly more. The first and most important source is from people, generally your stakeholders. Most of the requirements we've worked with so far in this course were coming from the product manager sponsoring the project, or the product analyst, who will be the actual internal user of the system. And this is good and appropriate. We're going to spend the entire next section of the course talking about different ways of eliciting requirements from stakeholders, so I won't talk too much more about them here. But keep in mind, however, that requirements can come from documentary sources as well, and there are two primary ones. One of the documentary sources will be pre-existing requirements documentation. You are probably not the first business analyst in your organization. There are probably heaps of requirements documentation around your office. You should look at these documents as a wellspring of information, a real asset of the organization. Why? Well, for a number of reasons. They give background on what projects have been run by your organization, why those projects were run, and what the requirements of those projects were. They also give you highly detailed descriptions of how various systems and processes and products operate. They can also be a reference that helps you define stakeholders if you don't already know who they are. And sometimes the requirements of those documents can be reused in your current project. Reading requirements documentation is a great way to learn about your organization, but there are some risks associated with it also. The material may simply be out of date. Requirement maintenance can be a time-consuming activity, and it's often deprioritized so you can get back to work on the next project. Also, very commonly, requirements documents are difficult to understand. They sometimes use technical jargon, which is internal to the organization. Often they're poorly written. Often they're poorly structured. The best way to overcome both of these challenges is to meet with the business analyst that authored the document and get them to explain it to you. The last type of source I'll mention is various types of standards. There are numerous organizations around the world that come up with different types of standards for various domains. These standards typically spell out a list of requirements for organizations to meet in order to achieve the standard. I'll give you some examples. Going back some years, I was working on a series of projects related to online banking security. In essence, developing online products that help to assure the security of our online systems and making sure that our clients' data was safe. There was a standard released by a kind of like a governmental advisory board called the FFIEC, which came up with a standard for online banking security that really became a major source of requirements for the project. And without that standard, we would have been sunk. It would have taken forever for us to deliver the project. Another example could be the various types of technical standards that have been developed. If you're familiar with HTML and JavaScript and HTTP, those were all developed as standards and have paid immeasurable dividends. While these are technical in nature, they can help you to understand web products quite a lot better. For example, I believe the HTTP standard describes different types of error conditions, like that 404 error that you've probably seen a million times. Those should be handled by web platforms and applications, and they might not be the requirements themselves, but they can help you make sure that you have everything covered. With any documentary source of requirements, I'll encourage you to do a few things. First, make sure that the information you're using is reliable. If it's a published material, make sure that you have the most up-to-date edition. Second, if you don't understand the material, bring in an expert. A good example is with a regulation. You might want to talk to a lawyer or a regulatory specialist. And last but not least, when you're documenting the requirement, don't just stick a document name in the source column. Make reference to the documentary source, but also make sure that there is an actual person documented as being the source. So you could list that lawyer or regulatory specialist as the source in the case that we were just talking about. I think that's about all we have for sources. Again, the majority of your requirements tend to come from live people, your stakeholders, and we're going to talk about how that works next.